He wasn't a decorated officer, and the hospital's new corporate owners wouldn't have known his name from any quarterly report. He was a 73-pound Belgian Malinois named Sentry, and 72 hours before he was rushed through the automatic doors of Low Country Advanced Animal Medical Center, he had thrown himself between a live pressure plate and 4 United States Marines during a classified combat readiness exercise gone violently wrong outside Camp Lejeune. Low Country Advanced Animal Medical Center sat off Interstate 26 in Summerville, South Carolina, close enough to Joint Base Charleston and the Marine installation at Beaufort to have built a reputation over 2 decades as the premier emergency facility for military working dogs along the southeastern seaboard. The equipment was legitimate: dual-energy CT scanners, a full hyparic brain chamber, a surgical suite that could have passed inspection at any human hospital. But 18 months ago, a private equity group called Meridian Health Capital had acquired the center as part of a portfolio of veterinary chains, and with them came Douglas Pelham. Pelham held the title of Regional Operations Director. He was 44 years old, wore his hair in the tight, bloodless style of someone who had never once arrived late to a budget meeting, and he approached every living patient in the building with the same detached arithmetic he applied to supply costs and overtime variance reports. He had never served a day in uniform. He had never knelt on a floor to comfort anything. He had once, in a staff meeting, referred to a terminally ill golden retriever as a non-recoverable asset. On a grey Thursday afternoon in October, the emergency bay doors burst open, and Chief Warrant Officer Seth Hargrove came through them at a dead run, his tactical shirt still damp with swamp mud from the exercise site, his arms full of 73 pounds of limp Belgian Malinois. Hargrove was 38, a MARSOC Marine raider who had served 4 overseas deployments. He had a jaw that looked like it had been carved from something unmovable, and eyes that carried the particular quality of stillness that belongs only to men who have spent years in very dangerous places and learned to stay very calm inside them. He was not calm now. "Trauma team now," he said to the front desk, and the words hit the lobby like a command on a radio net. Nina Driscoll was already moving before the receptionist lifted the phone. Nina was 29, the center's lead K9 rehabilitation nurse, and she was the kind of person who seemed to arrive in crisis situations slightly before the crisis did. She had a quiet, economical way of moving that animals read as safe: no sudden angles, no high-pitched tones, no performance of calm that wasn't backed by actual calm. She had grown up on a small horse farm outside Knoxville, spent 2 years volunteering with search and rescue dog units before nursing school, and written her graduate thesis on post-trauma neurological recovery in high-drive working dogs. She did not, as a rule, flinch. She took one look at Sentry and called out 3 orders simultaneously. "Get me a gurney, get Dr. Burke on the radio, and someone start a saline drip. His gums are white." Hargrove lowered Sentry onto the gurney with the careful, terrible tenderness of a man handling something he is terrified of breaking. The dog's hind legs were wrapped in field dressings, applied by Hargrove himself during the medevac ride, tight and correct, the kind of work that comes from a man who has done this before under worse conditions. A fragment from the detonation device had torn through Sentry's left hip. The concussive wave had done something to his breathing that the on-site medic hadn't been able to fully diagnose. "His name is Sentry," Hargrove said. "He doesn't like strangers." "He'll like me," Nina said, and she meant it as a simple statement of fact. She leaned in close to Sentry's face before touching him. She let him smell the back of her hand, knuckles down, the way you offered yourself to a dog you hadn't met yet. Sentry's eyes were half closed, shock pulling him toward somewhere dark, but his nose moved. He caught her scent. Something in the line of his muzzle shifted, barely perceptible, but Nina saw it. "Good," she said quietly. "I'm Nina. Let's get you fixed." Dr. Ansel Burke, the center's chief of surgery, was scrubbed in within 4 minutes. The procedure lasted nearly 7 hours. Burke extracted 3 metallic fragments from the hip joint, repaired a partially avulsed tendon, and stabilized what turned out to be a hairline fracture in the pelvis. The internal damage was significant but survivable. The real danger, Burke told Hargrove in the hallway afterward, wasn't the wounds. It was what the wounds would do to Sentry's mind. Military working dogs are not pets. They are not domesticated in the way a family golden retriever is domesticated. They are high-drive, hyper-vigilant animals trained to operate in chaos, to trust exactly one person completely, and to treat every other stimulus in the world as something to be assessed for threat. When a dog like that is injured, when the physical capability that defines its identity is stripped away, when it wakes up in a strange facility full of strange smells and people who reach for it with gloved hands, it doesn't simply recover, it regresses. It can refuse food, fight its handlers, and in documented cases, will itself toward heart failure through sustained, untreatable stress. For the first 5 days, Sentry was exactly that kind of nightmare. He wouldn't eat. He wouldn't drink from any bowl placed in his kennel by any technician who wasn't Nina. When the overnight staff reached in to change his IV dressing, he snapped, not wild, not frenzied, but deliberate, surgical snaps that sent 2 junior techs backing out of the kennel room with shaking hands. His heart rate on the monitors stayed elevated even when he was still. He slept only in short fragments, always with his back against the kennel wall. Except when Nina was there. She had a method that she couldn't fully explain to other people and didn't really try to. She would pull a folding chair up to the outside of his kennel, close enough that he could smell her without reaching, and she would talk. Not to him exactly, just out loud, about the other patients she'd treated, about her drive in that morning, about the horses she'd grown up with in Tennessee. Her voice stayed low and even, with the particular cadence of someone who is not trying to persuade anyone of anything. After the first 2 days, Sentry began lying down when she was there instead of standing rigid against the wall. After the 3rd day, he started eating from a shallow dish she slid through the kennel latch. After the 4th day, he let her change his bandages without restraint. Hargrove was at the center every visiting hour that base commitments would allow. He sat outside the kennel room glass in a plastic chair and watched. He was not a man who said much, but on the afternoon of the 5th day, when Nina came out to update him on Sentry's vitals, he looked at her for a moment before he spoke. "You're doing what the combat medics do," he said, "with the guys who come back wrong." "It's the same thing," Nina said. "Trauma doesn't know what species it's in." "He's better because of you. He's better because he's tough and we got to him fast. I just gave him something consistent to hold on to." She paused, looking back through the glass at the dog. "He's not out of the woods yet. The hip is stable, but he's still under. If he loses his anchor..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. On the 6th morning, Douglas Pelham called Nina into his office. She had been in that office twice since Meridian Health Capital took over. Both times she had come out of it with the unpleasant sensation of having tried to explain something important to someone who was not only uninterested, but structurally incapable of understanding why it mattered. The office smelled like sanitized air and expensive coffee, and Pelham kept his desk immaculately clear, except for whatever document he intended to use as a weapon. Today it was a staffing cost breakdown and a supply usage log. "Miss Driscoll," Pelham said, setting his reading glasses on the bridge of his nose with the deliberateness of someone performing authority, "you've accumulated 31 hours of unauthorized overtime in the past 9 days. Sentry's case required extended presence during stabilization hours. Dr. Burke signed off on the clinical necessity. Dr. Burke signs off on veterinary decisions, not staffing decisions. That's my department." He turned the supply log toward her. You've also been requisitioning Class B regenerative dressings for the working dog in Bay 4. Those dressings run $11 per application. The insurance authorization for this patient covers Class D standard gauze. Class D gauze adheres to the wound bed when it dries, Nina said. Her voice was very level. With a hip injury of that severity, every dressing change that pulls tissue risks tearing the surgical repair and introducing necrosis. I've documented this in the patient file. I read your documentation. Pelham folded his hands on the desk. What I didn't find was my pre-authorization signature, which is required under the supply expenditure protocol I issued in August. If I waited for a pre-authorization at 2 in the morning when his temperatures spiked, that dog would have gone septic. That dog, Pelham said carefully, represents a net operating loss of over $400 in premium supply costs alone. The military's reimbursement ceiling for this case was reached 48 hours ago. Every Class B dressing you put on that animal comes directly out of this facility's margin. He slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. Your employment with Low Country Advanced Animal Medical Center is terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you to collect your personal items. Nina looked at the termination letter for a moment without touching it. Sentry won't allow the junior staff to handle him. You know that. He'll regress within hours. We have a fully qualified team. You have 3 night techs who he has already snapped at twice. Pull me off this case, and that dog goes into cardiac stress. Dr. Burke will tell you the same thing. Dr. Burke doesn't make staffing decisions. Pelham stood, signaling the conversation was over. I do. 14 minutes later, Nina Driscoll walked out the back delivery entrance of Low Country Advanced Animal Medical Center with a cardboard box under one arm and her lanyard in the other hand because security had taken her badge. The rain was coming in off the coast, the particular low gray rain of a South Carolina October, and it soaked through her scrub jacket before she reached her car. She sat in the driver's seat for a long time without starting the engine. From somewhere deep in the building behind her, through the ventilation grates of the kennel ward, she heard it, a sound she recognized immediately because she had heard it only once before, from a retired search and rescue dog whose handler had died of a sudden heart attack. It was low and sustained and not quite a bark and not quite a howl. Something between the two. Something that didn't have a clean word for it in any language. Sentry knew she was gone. The collapse was faster than she'd feared. The night tech who went in to administer Sentry's 10 o'clock pain medication was a competent young man named Jake who had worked the kennel ward for 2 years and had a genuine affection for dogs. He did everything correctly. Low voice, slow movement, held the syringe behind his back. Sentry let him get within 2 feet of the kennel door before the lunge. Jake dropped the tray. The clatter of stainless steel instruments hitting concrete detonated something in Sentry's already fractured nervous system. By midnight, he had pulled his IV line. By 2 in the morning, the monitor was alarming on his heart rate. By dawn, his temperature had climbed a full 1.5 degrees, and he had pressed himself into the back left corner of the kennel and would not move for any person who came near. His front paws were flat against the concrete, and his eyes tracked every figure at the kennel door with the rapid, exhausted vigilance of an animal that has decided the world is fully hostile and is simply waiting. Dr. Burke went to Pelham at 6 that morning and told him plainly what was happening. He's presenting with stress cardiomyopathy, Burke said. His stress hormones are actively affecting his cardiac function. I've seen this in high-drive dogs before. If this continues, we are looking at heart failure in an animal that survived a catastrophic field injury and a 7-hour surgery. I want Nina back on this case. Miss Driscoll's employment has been terminated. Then unterminated. That decision isn't reversible based on a single patient outcome. Burke looked at him for a long moment. Douglas, that dog has a military service record. He saved 4 Marines' lives 3 days ago, and you fired the one person who could keep him alive over $11 bandages." "The decision stands," Pelham said. Seth Hargrove returned to the center at 8:30 that morning. He had been at Camp Lejeune overnight completing the after-action documentation on the training incident, the kind of administrative work that doesn't pause for anything, including a dog in cardiac failure. He had called the center's main line twice the previous evening and been told Sentry was stable and resting. He came through the front doors with a paper cup of gas-station coffee and the expression of a man who expects to be told good news. He heard the cardiac monitor alarm from the lobby. The kennel ward was through a set of double doors at the end of the main corridor. Hargrove went through them without checking in at the desk, which technically required a staff escort, and nobody stopped him because nobody in the hallway felt strongly enough about that protocol in that particular moment to put themselves in front of whatever was in that man's eyes. What he found in Bay 4 stopped him at the threshold. Sentry was in the corner. His surgical sights were weeping through a gauze wrap that hadn't been changed correctly. There was a small dark smear near the kennel latch, where he had raked his paw against it during the night. The monitor showed a heart rate that was too high and too irregular, and his breathing had the shallow, labored quality of an animal working hard just to stay above a line it was slowly approaching from the wrong direction. 3 junior techs stood in a loose cluster near the far wall, uncertain. Dr. Burke was there. Douglas Pelham had come down from his office and was standing in the corridor doorway in the posture of a man trying to appear like he was managing a situation he was clearly not managing. Hargrove set his coffee cup down on the counter beside the door, very carefully. The deliberateness of the gesture was more alarming than if he had thrown it. "Where is Nina Driscoll?" The junior techs looked at the floor. Burke exhaled slowly. "She was terminated yesterday morning. Budget dispute. Sentry has been deteriorating ever since." Hargrove turned and looked at Pelham. He didn't say anything for 4 full seconds, which turned out to be one of the more uncomfortable silences the kennel ward had ever contained. "You fired her," Hargrove said. "The staffing decision was a matter of. You fired the one person who could keep him alive while he was in crisis. Chief Warrant Officer, I understand this is an emotional." "Get out of this room," Hargrove said. He said it to the junior techs, to the orderlies in the hallway, to everyone except Pelham and Burke. Everybody except him and the doctor out. The techs went. Pelham drew himself up and made a sound intended to convey authority. "You do not give orders in this facility. This is private property, and I am." "You're going to call Nina Driscoll," Hargrove said, "and you're going to tell her to come back." "I will do no such." Hargrove moved. Not toward Pelham. Toward the kennel ward's secondary access door, the heavy reinforced door that connected Bay 4 to the adjacent surgical prep room and provided the only interior exit from the ward besides the main corridor. He reached it in 4 strides, examined the latch mechanism for approximately 2 seconds, and dragged a stainless steel instrument cart across the room and wedged it solidly under the door handle. He turned, took the IV pole from Sentry's vacated drip stand, and ran it horizontally through the handles of the main double doors, barring them from the inside. Then he pulled a chair from the corner, set it directly in front of Sentry's kennel, and sat down. "You can call whoever you need to call," Hargrove said to Pelham. His voice had dropped to something almost conversational, which was considerably more alarming than shouting. He spoke to Sentry in between sentences, low and steady, just sound, just presence. "Call the police if you want. Call your lawyers. Call whoever sits above you in that equity firm. But nobody comes through those doors, and nobody touches this animal until Nina Driscoll walks through them first." Pelham called the police. 3 Somerville PD units arrived within 11 minutes. Within 30 there were 6, and a mobile command post had been established in the parking lot. Word reached the shift supervisor, who called in Lieutenant Carla Owendale from the Crisis Response Unit. Owendale was 46 years old and had served 8 years in the Army as a military police officer before joining the force. She had spent the last 4 years running negotiated resolutions to situations that dispatch struggled to categorize correctly. She had a talent for reading the actual situation beneath whatever situation was being reported to her. When she looked through the reinforced glass of the kennel ward double doors and assessed what she saw, a Marine warrant officer sitting quietly in front of a dying dog's kennel with a visibly shaken administrator pressed against the far wall, she made her read fairly quickly. She knocked on the glass. Hargrove looked at her. His expression was not aggressive. It was simply finished. "Chief Warrant Officer Hargrove," Owendale said through the glass. "I'm Lieutenant Owendale. I ran with the 93rd MP Brigade out of Fort Gillam, 2004 to 2012. A pause from inside. "Ma'am, I'm not here to breach that room. I want you to know that up front." She looked at Sentry, at the monitor, at the quality of the light in the ward. "Tell me what you need." "Nina Driscoll. She's the rehab nurse this facility fired yesterday morning. Sentry won't allow anyone else near him, and he is going into cardiac failure. Bring her here." Owendale looked at the kennel monitor through the glass. The numbers were not reassuring. She turned to the officer behind her. "Get me a contact for a Nina Driscoll, recently terminated from this facility now." She turned back to the glass. "I'm working on it. Can you give me 20 minutes? Hargrove looked at the monitor. He might not have 20 minutes. Outside the glass, things were unraveling for Meridian Health Capital at a speed their quarterly risks assessment had failed to model. One of the techs who had been cleared from the kennel ward had filmed 40 seconds of the initial confrontation on her phone, not maliciously, purely out of shock, and texted it to a friend who posted it with 3 words of context. Within 90 minutes, it had been picked up by a military spouse Facebook group with 84,000 members, then by a veterans account with 200,000 followers, then by a Charleston news station that dispatched a crew, before the reporter finished reading the story brief. The chyron running across the bottom of the noon broadcast read, "Marine locks down Somerville's vet hospital to protect injured 9 war hero." In the parking lot, where police tape marked the perimeter, the first pickup truck with a Marine Corps bumper sticker arrived at 12:15. By 1 o'clock, there were 11 vehicles. By 1:30, there were people standing in the October rain, holding umbrellas and handmade signs that read "Sendy is one of Euros" and "Cooperate Greed Kills Heroes." A contingent of veteran motorcycle riders came in from North Charleston. 2 active-duty MPs from the Beaufort installation showed up off-duty in civilian clothes and stood at the edge of the perimeter with their arms folded, not saying anything, just present. In a tower office in Atlanta, the CEO of Meridian Health Capital, a man named Gordon Archibald, was watching a live news feed on his desktop monitor and experiencing the precise physical sensation of something he had spent 15 years building coming apart in real time. His phone showed 16 missed calls from institutional investors and 2 from a congressman's staff director whose district contained 3 other Meridian facilities. He called Douglas Pelham's cell. Inside the kennel ward, Pelham felt his phone vibrate and saw Archibald's name on the screen. He stepped as far from Hargrove as the room allowed and answered in a whisper. "Mr. Archibald, I want you to know that law enforcement is on site and we are actively—" "Stop!" Archibald's voice was not raised. It was the kind of quiet that precedes something irreversible. "I have a congressman's office calling me about a dog. I have our institutional partners asking whether we have a media crisis. I have an employee we fired for using an $11 bandage now on national television. The overtime costs alone." "Douglas," a beat of silence. "You are terminated, effective this call. Do not speak to media. Do not speak to police on behalf of this company. Surrender your credentials and leave the building when law enforcement clears you to do so. HR will be in contact." The call ended. Pelham stood in the corner of the kennel ward with his phone in his hand, and the ruins of his professional authority settling around him like ash after a fire. Across the room, Hargrove watched him without expression. "Goes fast," Hargrove said quietly, almost to himself, "when the math stops working in your favor." He turned back to Sentry and kept talking to him, low and steady, the way he had talked to men in his unit on the worst nights of the worst deployments, not to say anything in particular, just to prove that another voice was still there. The knock on the glass came again, Owendale. "Hargrove, she's here." He was on his feet before she finished the sentence. Through the glass, he could see Owendale stepping back, and beside her, soaked through from the parking lot rain. Her hair flattened against her face, still in the running shoes and athletic clothes she had grabbed, because she had been in the middle of a morning run when the police called. Nina Driscoll. She wasn't looking at Hargrove. She was looking through the glass at the kennel monitor, reading numbers, calculating something, already working. Hargrove pulled the IV pole out of the door handles. He shoved the instrument cart aside and pushed the double doors open. Nina didn't wait. She walked past Owendale, past the space where Pelham had been standing, and went straight to the kennel. "Give me a minute alone with him before anyone brings equipment in," she said, and didn't look up. She knelt on the concrete in front of Sentry's kennel. He was in the back corner, pressed flat, his breathing audible and wrong, his eyes moving to her, and then away, and then back. She recognized the particular exhausted suspicion in his face, not aggression anymore, because he didn't have the reserves for aggression. Just the last withdrawal of a creature that had decided the world and had made its peace hostile, and had made its peace with that. She didn't reach for the latch. She sat on the floor with her back against the kennel bars, and turned slightly sideways, not looking at him directly. She started talking, the way she always did, about nothing in particular. About the police car ride over in the rain, about a dog she'd treated 2 years back who had also been terrified of the kennel floors in his first week and had turned out completely fine, about how the sky was finally supposed to clear by Thursday. Her voice stayed low and even, and had the particular quality of not trying to be anything other than what it was. From the corner stillness, then a faint shift, then Sentry moved. Not all the way, just enough, his front paws extending 3 inches forward, his nose lifting, testing the air, finding something in it that had been absent for more than 20 hours. "Hey, buddy," Nina said softly. "I know, I'm sorry I was gone." She reached back and opened the latch without looking at it, her eyes still off to the side, still talking. She pushed the door open and left it there and didn't go in. Sentry came to her. He dragged himself forward on his front paws, the injured hip carrying him slowly until his nose touched the back of her hand. She held still. He pressed his forehead against her knee and let out a long, broken exhale that wasn't quite a whimper and wasn't quite anything else, but was absolutely unmistakable to every person, watching through the glass. "Okay," Nina said. Her voice cracked slightly, and she let it. "Okay, Dr. Burke, I need the cardiac protocol and fresh fluids, and someone bring me the class-off dressings, all of them." She worked for 40 minutes inside that kennel, one hand always on Sentry, talking the entire time. Burke passed things to her through the door. Hargrove stood outside and watched with his arms at his sides, and something in his expression that was too large to name and too private to look at directly. The monitor changed slowly. The numbers came down the way real things happen, not all at once, but gradually, and then more, the alarm ceasing, the rhythm steadying until the screen showed a heart rate that was bad but not catastrophic, then concerning but manageable, then something approaching the far outer edge of acceptable. At the 40-minute mark, Sentry was asleep with his head pressed heavily into Nina's lap, pinning her leg against the concrete floor in a way that would definitely bruise. She sat there and let him. Outside the kennel ward, Lieutenant Owendale found Hargrove leaning against the corridor wall with the particular exhausted lean of a man who has been holding something up by sheer will for several hours and has just been permitted to stop. She held up her notepad. "I need a formal statement regarding the incident in Bay 4. "I understand," he held out his wrists. Owendale looked at him for a moment. She had run 8 years as a military police officer, and she had an accurate sense of what kind of person she was looking at. She put the notepad away. "My official report reflects that I responded to a call regarding a dangerous animal in acute medical distress. Upon arrival, I found a credentialed military handler assisting the medical team in securing the ward to prevent further harm to staff and patient. Once the appropriate clinical personnel arrived, the animal was stabilized without incident. No one was detained, no property was damaged, and no charges are being filed." Hargrove looked at her steadily. "Is that an accurate summary of today's events, Chief Warrant Officer?" He lowered his wrists slowly. "That is completely accurate, Lieutenant. Thank you for your service." "Get your dog home," she said. "That's an order." She walked out into the corridor, and through the kennel ward glass, Nina Driscoll was visible in the corner of the frame, sitting on the concrete with a 73-pound Belgian Malinois asleep across her legs. One hand resting on his ribs to feel his breathing, her eyes closed. The recovery took 4 months and 11 days, and it was not a straight line. There was a secondary infection in the hip joint in week 3. There was a night in week 6 when Sentry's temperature climbed without warning, and Nina drove to the center at midnight and did not leave until it came down. There was a period in month 2 when the pain in the hip was bad enough that he stopped bearing weight on it entirely, and they had to reset the rehabilitation protocol from an earlier stage and start again. Nina was there for all of it. Gordon Archibald, managing the most severe reputational crisis in Meridian Health Capital's operational history, moved quickly on the internal restructuring. Within 10 days of Pelham's termination, Nina Driscoll had been formally promoted to Director of Rehabilitation Services. Full clinical autonomy over her ward, a budget she controlled, purchasing authority for whatever her patients required. The company also issued a public statement announcing a 6-figure donation to the Military Working Dog Foundation, a contribution that one journalist dryly noted was roughly 12,000 times the cost of the bandages that had started everything. Nina used Class B dressings on everyone. On a cold, clear morning in February, Seth Hargrove came through the front doors of Low Country Advanced Animal Medical Center for the last time as a visitor. He was in his service alphas, the formal green uniform with the rank insignia and the service ribbons, more decorations than most people accumulate in a full career. Sentry walked beside him on a loose lead. The left hip carried a slight hitch that the veterinary orthopedist said would likely always be there, and that Sentry had clearly decided to simply work around. His head was up, his ears were forward. His tail moved in the steady, confident sweep of a dog that has made its determination about the world and found it manageable. Nina was waiting near the front desk. She had worked a full shift and meant to change before they arrived, but had gotten caught up in a patient case and then lost track of the time, and so she was in scrubs with a chart still in her hand when the doors opened. The dog saw her before she saw the dog, and his tail went from steady to something more urgent, and he pulled at the lead once before Hargrove let him go. She crouched down, and Sentry put his head on her shoulder with the full, unhesitating trust of an animal that has made its decision about exactly one person in the world and has absolutely no interest in revisiting it. She held him for a moment, then she stood. Hargrove was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the controlled stillness of the standoff, not the quiet desperation of those early days by the kennel glass. Something quieter than either of those things, and more settled and more durable. Medically retired, he said. Official as of last week. He comes home with me. Good, she said, and she meant it without reservation. Hargrove looked at her for another moment. Then he took one step back, brought his heels together, and snapped a salute that was so crisp and complete and absolutely serious that the two administrative staff at the front desk went very still. Nina was not military. She had never been saluted in her life. She didn't know the protocol for receiving one, whether she was supposed to return it. What the correct response was to a decorated Marine warrant officer in full dress uniform saluting a woman in surgical scrubs in a veterinary center lobby. There was no regulation that covered it. There was no manual she had ever read. She put her hand over her heart. Hargrove held the salute for 3 full seconds. Then he dropped it, clipped Sentry's lead, and walked out through the front doors into the cold February morning. Sentry's nails clicked on the tile as he went, 4-beat, with the faint syncopation of a fully healed hip, and then they were through the doors and the sound was gone. Nina watched them through the glass until they reached the truck, until Hargrove opened the passenger door and Sentry climbed in without assistance on a hip that 3 months ago no one had been certain he would ever use again, until the truck pulled out of the parking lot and disappeared around the corner, and the parking lot was just a parking lot again, quiet in the winter light. She stood there a moment longer, her hand still resting over her chest. Then she picked up her chart, turned around, and went back to her patients.